Nothing is happening, and that is what makes it unbearable. The sea is calm, almost unnaturally so, and the ship moves through it as if afraid to disturb the darkness. No lights burn on deck. No voices rise above a whisper. Every man knows his place, and every man knows why silence matters. In this moment, before violence, before noise, before death, silence is not peace. It is pressure. For sailors in World War II, this was the true beginning of battle. Not the firing of guns, not the shock of explosions, but the long, suffocating wait that came before. The hours when nothing could be seen, yet everything felt close. The ocean at night erased certainty. It removed distance. It swallowed shape and direction until the world shrank to the narrow strip of deck beneath one's boots and the steel walls humming faintly with the sound of restrained engines. Silence made the mind work against itself. Men listened harder than they ever had in their lives. The creak of metal expanding in the cool air, the faint slap of water against the hull, the distant churn of propellers that might belong to a friendly ship or might belong to something hunting them. Every sound demanded interpretation. Every sound carried the possibility of danger. Fog made it worse. Fog did not arrive violently, it crept. It rolled in slowly, erasing the horizon first, then the sky, then the sense of scale. A ship 50 meters away could vanish completely. A mast could appear and disappear like a ghost. The sea became a closed room with no walls and no exits. In fog, sailors could not trust their eyes. Shapes lied. Distance meant nothing. A shadow might be a cloud of mist, or it might be stealing guns and men who had already seen you. Training told them not to imagine. Experience told them imagination was unavoidable. This was not the fear of sudden danger, it was worse. It was the fear of waiting, the kind that builds slowly, quietly until it becomes part of the body. Shoulders tightened. Hands clenched unconsciously. Breathing became deliberate, controlled, almost mechanical. Men learned to regulate themselves because panic was louder than any weapon. At sea, panic killed faster than shells. Orders were given in murmurs. Messages passed hand to hand. Officers used gestures instead of voices. Even laughter, when it happened, was brief and hollow. Sailors wrapped tools in cloth so metal would not strike metal. Boots moved softly across steel decks polished smooth by years of use. The ship itself seemed to participate in the silence, moving carefully, restrained, as if it understood that noise meant exposure. In this environment, courage was quiet. There were no speeches, no dramatic declarations. Courage was standing at a post for hours without moving, eyes straining into darkness that offered nothing in return. Courage was resisting the urge to speak, to ask questions, to fill the silence with something familiar. Courage was trusting training when instinct urged retreat. Every sailor knew what would happen if the ship was found. Naval warfare offered no gradual escalation. When violence arrived, it arrived all at once. A single shell could tear open compartments, ignite fuel, sever power, and trap men below deck with nowhere to run. Fire spread faster at sea. Water followed soon after. Survival depended on speed, coordination, and luck could not be controlled. This knowledge lived beneath the silence. Men did not speak of it, but they felt it. Each vibration of the whole carried the weight of consequence. Each passing minute without incident brought relief, but also tension, because relief could vanish instantly. The waiting was endless. Time behaved strangely at sea. Minutes stretched unnaturally long. Watches felt heavier on the wrist. Sailors checked instruments not because they expected change, but because routine offered structure in a world stripped of reference points. The ocean at night was disorienting. Without a visible horizon, the ship seemed suspended in nothingness. There was no up or down beyond what the body remembered. Fog pressed close, dampening sound, flattening perspective, turning the world inward. In that inward space, thoughts wandered. Men thought of home, of faces remembered imperfectly, of ordinary moments that now felt impossibly distant. Some prayed silently. Others repeated procedures in their heads, rehearsing damage control steps, gunnery drills, emergency actions. Preparation was a way to keep fear from growing too large. Fear was never absent. It was managed. Discipline demanded that fear remain invisible. A sailor who showed at risk spreading it. One anxious voice could infect an entire watch. Commanders understood this. So did the men. Fear was allowed, but only privately and only briefly. Silence enforced discipline better than orders ever could. The enemy was silent too. Somewhere beyond the fog, other ships moved with the same caution. Other men stood listening, waiting, imagining. Both sides believed the same thing, that concealment favored them. That darkness belonged to the trained and the disciplined. This belief was comforting. Darkness had always been a shield. Fog had always been protection. Generations of sailors had survived by trusting that if they could not see, neither could the enemy. The sea, indifferent and vast, had always imposed limits on human perception. Those limits had shaped doctrine, training, and expectation. Men trusted them. Below decks, however, something new existed, something most sailors barely understood. Faint green light spilled from small rooms where operators stared into glowing screens. These men were quiet too, their work precise, methodical, almost detached from the sensory world above. They did not listen for engines. They did not scan the fog. They watched returns. But most of the crew did not think about that. Not yet. Tradition was stronger than novelty. Experience outweighed theory. Silence still felt like safety. On deck, lookouts strained their eyes into gray nothingness, confident that if danger came, they would see it first. They had been trained for this. They trusted their vision, their instincts, their ability to read subtle changes in the environment. Fog to them was familiar. What they did not know was that the nature of silence had changed. Silence used to mean absence. Now it could mean observation. The waiting continued. Engines maintained steady speed. Courses held. Formation spacing preserved by careful navigation and trust between ships that could not see one another. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, which made the silence feel earned. Men relaxed slightly, though never completely. Relief came in small increments. A cigarette smoked quietly behind shielding, a brief exchange of glances, a shared understanding that this moment, at least, was safe. Then it wasn't. The transition from silence to violence was instantaneous. There was no warning shot, no sighting report, no shouted alarm, just impact. A sudden, brutal shock that traveled through steel and bone alike. The ship shuddered violently as shells struck from a direction that made no sense. The mind struggled to catch up. Where did that come from? How did they find us? Where are they? There was nothing to see. Fog still wrapped the ship completely. Darkness remained absolute. No muzzle flashes cut through the mist. No silhouettes emerged. Only explosions and fire and the screaming reality that the enemy was already engaging with terrifying accuracy. Silence had not protected them. It had exposed them. Confusion followed immediately. Orders were shouted now, but they competed with noise and damage and fear. Men ran to stations they had rehearsed 1,000 times, but rehearsals did not account for the impossible. They were being attacked by something unseen. Training told them to respond, but instinct demanded explanation. Without explanation, fear surged dangerously close to panic. Officers worked to reassert control, to impose structure on chaos, but the fundamental problem remained. They could not see the enemy. Shots landed again closer, more precise. Steel tore, fire erupted. Smoke mixed with fog until the air itself seemed to choke. The ship was illuminated not by stars or moonlight, but by burning metal. Only then did some men understand the truth. Silence had not meant invisibility. Darkness had not meant concealment. The old assumptions no longer applied. The realization was devastating, not just tactically, but psychologically. Everything they believed about safety, about concealment, about the balance between hunter and hunted had been wrong. The sea had not changed, but the way war was fought upon it had. For sailors who had trusted silence their entire careers, this was not just defeat, it was disorientation at the deepest level. The world no longer behaved as expected. The cause and effect had been severe. Men fought on because that was what sailors did. They extinguished fires, they returned fire blindly. They followed orders that made sense within an older framework, even as that framework collapsed around them. Some survived, some did not. What remained afterward was not just damage to steel and machinery, but damage to certainty. The understanding that silence could no longer be trusted. That waiting no longer meant safety. That the moments before battle were no longer neutral, but potentially fatal. In later years, many veterans would struggle to explain this to those who had not been there. They would talk about explosions and loss, but when pressed, they often returned to the same memory. The quiet, the waiting, the belief that nothing was happening. Silence had once been a shield. In that war, it became a warning. The ocean stretched endlessly, dark and indifferent, as if it had no interest in the lives of men who moved upon it. Every wave reflected moonlight filtered through clouds, turning the water into a surface of silver and gray, simultaneously beautiful and treacherous. Sailors had always understood that the sea was both a shield and a threat. It could hide them from enemies just as easily as it could conceal the approach of death. In World War II, that understanding was both challenged and redefined as technology began to reshape the rules that had governed naval combat for centuries. For Japanese sailors, particularly those trained in the art of night fighting, the fog and darkness were allies, trusted companions that had protected their missions in the past. The night was a canvas they knew how to navigate, a world where skill and experience turned uncertainty into opportunity. Every training exercise, every engagement in the early years of the war reinforced the belief that with careful observation, disciplined coordination, and precise execution, the Japanese Navy could dominate even the most chaotic battles. The optical devices on board were unmatched, their resolution and clarity allowing lookouts to identify enemy silhouettes at distances that would have been impossible for other navies. The crews drilled constantly, learning to interpret the subtlest changes in light and shadow, to anticipate the movement of enemy vessels by observing patterns in the water, the angle of a mast, or the reflection of a signal lamp. Their torpedoes, the famed long lance, carried not only destructive power, but also the confidence of their crews. Every ship, every captain, every sailor believed that darkness and fog gave them an unassailable advantage that their eyes and their training could see through the night when others could not. Lieutenant Kenji Sato felt that confidence as he moved across the wet, slippery deck, his hands trailing along the cold steel railing for balance. At 26, he had survived multiple engagements, and his mind had been shaped by stories of victories won under cover of night. Every lesson, every command, every maneuver had been drilled into him until instinct and calculation became inseparable. He understood the danger, certainly, but he had also internalized the belief that the Japanese Navy had mastered night combat. On the bridge, Captain Tishi Yamamoto reviewed the mission orders one final time. His 3 destroyer task force carried supplies and reinforcements to a distant garrison, moving under weather conditions that seemed to make detection impossible. Fog hung thick over the Solomon Sea, reducing visibility to barely 50 meters, and the captain trusted the natural concealment it provided. The crews were operating as they had been trained. Signal lamps flashed briefly and carefully, navigation was precise, and formation was maintained with a discipline born of years of practice. They were in every measurable way ready. And yet, something unseen was preparing to challenge all of their assumptions. Across the sea, the American destroyers were not relying on sight. They were not waiting for luck or chance encounters. Instead, Lieutenant Commander James Patterson and his crew studied a glowing screen, tracing the movements of 3 Japanese destroyers with perfect accuracy. The SG radar aboard the USS Fletcher provided a continuous electronic picture of the task force, turning fog and darkness from a protective shroud into a transparent curtain. Seaman Robert Chen adjusted the controls, ensuring that each blip on the screen was accurately represented in range, speed, and bearing. The information that Patterson and his captain, William Bradley, had at their disposal was precise, actionable, and devastatingly complete. Japanese crews relied on their eyes and their experience. American crews relied on machines and doctrine that integrated those machines into every decision. The contrast between the two approaches was not abstract, it was absolute. Where the Japanese task force believed itself hidden, it was perfectly visible. Where they trusted their instincts, the Americans trusted information that left no room for error. As the Japanese ships cut through the fog, maintaining formation and speed, they believed themselves undetectable. The fog, their ally, seemed to confirm their assumptions. Lieutenant Sato moved from one station to another, ensuring that every procedure was followed, that every crew member understood the importance of timing, coordination, and silence. Morale was high because everything appeared to be going according to plan. Captain Yamamoto could see the slight swell of waves and the gray outlines of companion ships through the dense mist, trusting in their positions and in the training that had made them reliable in the past. Yet, while the Japanese task force focused on mastery of their environment, the Americans had mastered a new element altogether: the ability to perceive the battlefield without relying on natural senses. The Fletcher's radar operators tracked movement that would have been invisible to even the most experienced human eye. Every course change, every speed adjustment, every subtle maneuver was represented on a screen, updated in real time, and communicated across the fleet. Captain Bradley's orders were calm and deliberate. General quarters were sounded, but without alarm or noise that might betray their presence. Each sailor moved with purpose, guided not by fear, but by knowledge, by certainty that their actions were informed and precise. For the Japanese, the fog remained a shield. For the Americans, it was irrelevant, a neutral backdrop to the information that allowed them to dictate the engagement. As minutes passed, the distance between the forces decreased, though the Japanese crews remained unaware. Every system aboard the Fletcher and her sister ships worked in harmony: radar detection, feeding plotting boards informing radio orders directing coordinated maneuvers. The Japanese ships were effectively blind to the incoming threat, while the Americans had a continuously updated picture that allowed them to choose exactly when and how to strike. Lieutenant Sato commented to Captain Yamamoto on the flawless execution of the mission thus far. The sea was calm, the fog dense, and the formation intact. Every man knew his duties and fulfilled them with precision. The Japanese leadership trusted their traditional tactics and technological edge, confident that the fog would continue to conceal their movements. They had fought the Americans under similar conditions before, and their doctrine emphasized night fighting skills that had historically turned darkness into an advantage. But this night, the rules were changing in ways that would become painfully apparent. Radar detection, coordinated fire control, and the ability to operate as an integrated system were tools the Americans wielded with expertise. Each blip on the radar was more than a target. It was an opportunity, a datum that informed decisions and allowed action with certainty. When the Fletcher's guns fired, the first salvo found the Japanese ships without warning. The fog had not obscured them at all. Explosions erupted along the starboard side of the Akatsuki, the steel shuddering under the impact. Captain Yamamoto's mind raced to reconcile what he saw with what he felt. There was no visual detection. No enemy ships could be seen. and yet the attack was accurate, precise, and devastating. The orders given in preparation for defensive maneuvers now seemed insufficient, inadequate in the face of a force guided by information rather than sight. Lieutenant Sato rushed to the communication station, attempting to coordinate with companion ships while also seeking to understand how the Americans had located them so accurately. The fog remained impenetrable to the human eye, but irrelevant to the electronic sensors directing the attack. The crew responded as trained, maneuvering, firing, and attempting evasive actions. Yet these actions were based on approximate estimates, while the American forces operated with exact knowledge. Each torpedo launched by the Japanese was guided by intent and doctrine, but without accurate detection, they fell short. Every evasive turn, every increase in speed was already anticipated, tracked, and countered. The Americans maintained formation and situational awareness that allowed them to control the engagement entirely, dictating when and where destruction would occur. As the battle continued, Japanese ships sustained further damage. Crew members were injured, fires broke out. The coordination that had previously been their strength became impossible under the assault of an enemy that could see through the conditions they relied on for protection. Captain Yamamoto issued dispersal orders, an acknowledgement of the limits of their tactics in the face of overwhelming information superiority. The mission, once so carefully planned, now disintegrated under forces they could not perceive or fully understand. Retreat became necessary, survival paramount, and the supply run to the garrison would fail. Each decision, made with discipline and courage, now revealed the limitations of training unaligned with emerging technologies. Sailors who had trusted their instincts and eyes now had to confront the reality that they were navigating a battlefield defined not by human senses, but by mechanical perception and data integration. The Fletcher and her sister ships exemplified the new paradigm. Rudder operators tracked, plotted, and communicated. Captains directed with confidence. Guns fired with calculated precision, not guesswork. Coordination was not based on visibility but on information, and that information rendered the fog, the night, and the natural concealment of the sea meaningless. The psychological impact on Japanese crews was profound. Confusion, fear, and disbelief competed with the training that had once ensured confidence. The effectiveness of long-established tactics, superior torpedoes, and extensive night fighting training diminished when confronted with an enemy that could perceive the battlefield without relying on the same senses. Orders were executed, maneuvers attempted, defensive fire directed, but each action was always one step behind, anticipated and accounted for by forces operating in an informational dimension beyond human perception. Amid smoke, fire, and destruction, the human element remained. Sailors still acted with courage, discipline, and determination. Officers still directed with calm and authority. Yet, the fundamental balance had shifted. Knowledge, data, and communication now outweighed instinct, visibility, and tradition. The outcome was determined not by bravery or experience alone, but by who controlled and interpreted information with speed, precision, and trust in its accuracy. Throughout the engagement, every layer of command and action revealed the growing chasm between the two approaches. The Japanese relied on what they could see, what they could measure by eye and hand. The Americans relied on what they could know using technology to extend perception beyond the limits of natural senses. By the end of the battle, the consequences of this disparity were clear. Japanese ships had suffered damage, their mission had failed, and their understanding of naval warfare had been fundamentally challenged. Survivors would carry forward lessons not just about courage, skill, or preparation, but about the emergence of a new era where information, rather than sight or instinct, dictated the flow of battle. And yet, in the midst of loss and confusion, the human drive for survival, adaptation, and resilience persisted as crews recalibrated their understanding, reconciled experience with new reality, and prepared for the engagements that lay ahead. War has always been a contest of perception as much as power, and in the crucible of World War II, this principle became more apparent than ever before. Commanders once relied upon their senses, their judgment, and their experience to gauge the battlefield, to predict the movements of ships, planes, and men, and to make life or death decisions with incomplete knowledge. They learned to trust the horizon, the wind, the clouds, and the faint sounds of engines over water. Every advantage, every piece of information gleaned from observation or reconnaissance carried weight because the unknown dominated every decision. Yet by the early 1940s, that balance began to shift. The emergence of electronic detection, particularly radar, transformed what commanders could know and therefore what they could achieve. The fundamental nature of war, the very way battles were fought, changed not with a single strike, but quietly, invisibly, in the rooms where screens glowed green and operators recorded every blip with precision and care. Information became a weapon. Where once bravery and instinct decided engagements, now data and knowledge determined outcomes. The night, previously a veil that masked movement and offered protection, no longer guaranteed concealment. A commander could no longer assume that darkness or fog rendered him invisible to the enemy. The psychological impact of this shift was profound. For centuries, naval officers had trained themselves to read the signs of the sea, to interpret subtle changes in the environment, to anticipate the enemy's course with limited cues. These skills were honed through experience, rewarded by victories, and trusted implicitly. Yet now, a single screen could display the positions, speed, and bearing of multiple enemy vessels with clarity that human senses could not achieve. This created an asymmetry in situational awareness, a gulf between those who knew and those who guessed, and in warfare that gulf became lethal. Onboard ships operating with radar operators became the eyes of commanders, translating raw electronic signals into actionable intelligence. They did not merely detect, they calculated, predicted, and guided, providing their captains with a continuous and accurate representation of the battlefield. Decisions that had once been reactive could now be anticipatory. Leaders could choose when and where to strike, when to maneuver, and when to withdraw, confident in their understanding of enemy positions. The enemy, meanwhile, remained blind, navigating a world where every movement was monitored but unseen. The implications extended beyond the tactical into the psychological. Sailors accustomed to trusting their own perceptions found themselves vulnerable to attacks from forces they could neither see nor hear. Shells could land with deadly precision in conditions that had previously been considered protective. Darkness no longer conferred safety, fog no longer concealed. Every maneuver, every attempt at stealth was nullified by the ability of radar-equipped forces to perceive the unseen. Training became secondary to information. Experience, while still valuable, could not compensate for lack of knowledge. A seasoned commander relying on centuries of established tactics could be outmaneuvered by a younger officer who had mastered the art of interpreting data from electronic systems. The speed at which decisions could be made increased exponentially, whereas once commanders had to act cautiously, compensating for uncertainty, now they could act decisively, guided by reliable and immediate information. This created an entirely new tempo in naval engagements, one that required coordination and integration of systems at every level. Communication, once a challenge fraught with delays and misinterpretations, became streamlined. Reports from radar operators could be shared across ships, creating a shared situational picture that allowed coordinated maneuvers over distances and in conditions where visual contact was impossible. The sea, the sky, and even the weather, previously obstacles, became parameters to be measured and accounted for rather than sources of uncertainty. In this environment, the notion of surprise shifted. Surprise no longer relied solely on stealth or deception, but could be engineered by using information superiority to anticipate enemy actions. A fleet could intercept, flank, or ambush an opponent who believed he was hidden, who believed the battlefield to be a blank slate upon which he controlled the narrative. This represented a fundamental change in the calculus of naval warfare. One side could operate with nearly perfect awareness, while the other struggled in the fog of incomplete knowledge. The psychological weight of this imbalance affected morale, risk assessment, and decision-making. Japanese crews trained to fight under cover of night and to rely on superior optics and torpedoes found that these advantages were rendered moot. The tactics that had produced victories in the early years of the war no longer yielded success against forces that could see through darkness with mechanical precision. The effectiveness of the long-lance torpedo, once a source of immense strategic confidence, diminished when targeting information was unreliable. Maneuvers designed to evade detection failed because the opponent anticipated them based on data rather than observation. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Engagements became lopsided, with one side dictating the flow and outcome. Traditional doctrines, carefully built over decades, were suddenly obsolete in the face of a technology-driven paradigm. The nature of command shifted. A captain could no longer rely solely on intuition or past experience. He had to understand, interpret, and integrate information from new sources, translating it into actionable orders. Failure to do so resulted in catastrophic losses. This transition required not only technological acquisition, but also cultural and organizational adaptation. Trust in information systems had to replace instinctual reliance on human senses. Crews needed training not only in operation, but also in understanding the limitations, strengths, and possibilities afforded by radar and other detection technologies. The integration of information systems into doctrine became as critical as the mastery of gunnery or navigation. Commanders who embraced this shift gained a decisive advantage. They could execute operations with confidence, coordinating multiple vessels in complex maneuvers, predicting enemy reactions, and exploiting gaps with precision. Ships became nodes in a network of knowledge, each one contributing to a collective awareness that transcended the limitations of individual perception. The consequences of this transformation were evident in engagements across the Pacific theater. Battles were won or lost not purely on firepower, armor, or numerical strength, but on the ability to perceive, interpret, and act upon information faster and more accurately than the opponent. Commanders who controlled knowledge controlled outcomes. This principle extended beyond naval engagements, influencing air and ground operations as well. The ability to track, predict, and coordinate became central to operational success, foreshadowing modern concepts of network-centric warfare. In every encounter, the asymmetry created by information superiority magnified the effectiveness of traditional assets. Guns fired with precision, torpedoes struck targets effectively, and maneuvers achieved their intended results, all because commanders knew where and when to act. Conversely, forces operating without equivalent information were forced into reactive postures, their bravery and skill insufficient to overcome the fundamental disadvantage. The lessons were stark and immediate. Naval officers came to understand that mastery of traditional skills was necessary but not sufficient. Commanders had to integrate technology into strategy, understand its implications, and exploit its advantages fully. Failure to do so meant operating in a world where the enemy could anticipate every move, see through every concealment, and strike with confidence and precision. The emergence of information as a decisive factor also reshaped tactical thinking. The traditional emphasis on concealment, surprise, and instinctive judgment gave way to anticipatory planning, coordinated maneuvers based on continuous detection, and calculated engagement designed to maximize the advantage of knowledge. Information superiority amplified every decision, every action, and every tactical choice. Sailors and commanders alike had to adapt not only to new tools but to a new understanding of how war was waged. The psychological dimension of this shift was profound. Knowledge created confidence, ignorance bred hesitation and error. A force that could observe without being seen held both tactical and moral advantage. The enemy, unable to detect, constantly second-guessed actions, reacted belatedly, and suffered losses before even understanding the battlefield. Information became a force multiplier of unprecedented significance. The integration of radar and related technologies into operational doctrine demonstrated the power of anticipation over reaction, precision over chance, and coordination over individual initiative. It represented a systemic change in the conduct of war, where mastery of perception equaled mastery of action. Every layer of command had to embrace this reality. Decisions that once depended upon intuition and limited observation now required continuous interpretation of data, analysis, and responsive action. Training evolved to reflect these needs. Operators became crucial nodes in the command structure, translating blips into strategies, numbers into decisions. The tempo of battle accelerated. Engagements could be planned with an accuracy that eliminated much of the guesswork and risk traditionally associated with naval combat. The sea, long a domain of uncertainty, was transformed into a domain of measurable parameters, controlled not by vision but by information. The principles discovered in these engagements laid the groundwork for the future of naval doctrine. Understanding, collecting, and leveraging information became as critical as shipbuilding, gunnery, or seamanship. Technological adaptation, doctrinal integration, and organizational change became inseparable from operational success. Commanders who failed to integrate information effectively risked defeat, regardless of their skill or courage. In this new reality, victory was determined by who could see more, process faster, and act decisively. The traditional reliance on sight, instinct, and experience was no longer sufficient. Forces that adapted to the age of information gained a permanent advantage, one that reshaped the course of engagements and ultimately the war itself. This transformation was gradual but inexorable. Battles were fought, lessons learned, and doctrines revised to incorporate the decisive role of information. The psychological and operational impact of these changes permeated every level of command, from the bridge to the gunnery stations, from fleet admirals to individual sailors. Understanding the battlefield through electronic perception became a force multiplier that magnified both the effectiveness and efficiency of all available assets. In every engagement, the side that controlled information dictated the tempo, determined the outcome, and shaped the consequences, fundamentally redefining what it meant to be powerful at sea. The emergence of information as a dominant factor also influenced post-engagement analysis, strategy formulation, and the allocation of resources. Planners recognized that technological superiority in detection and communication could outweigh numerical inferiority, that battles could be preemptively managed, and that attrition could be minimized through precise, informed action. The interplay between human skill and technological advantage created a new paradigm in which warfare could no longer be understood purely in terms of courage or firepower.